In the early mornings before the sun cleared the ridge, the creek belonged only to the land. Amber light slid low across the limestone shelves, turning the water the color of old glass. A kingfisher perched on the same bent branch every day, snapping down into the shallows with a sharp splash before the world fully woke up. When the wind moved through the cottonwoods, it didn't rush, it whispered. That was the quiet I paid for. Not silence, but balance. Nothing forced, nothing out of place. I was standing knee-deep in that water when the sound broke it. Loud, careless, wrong. It wasn't echoing from my house. It wasn't coming from my land. It was coming from strangers. Kids splashed where the moss had always been left alone. Adults shouted over one another, voices bouncing off stone that had never carried noise like that before. I heard the scrape of metal as someone dragged a folding chair across limestone shaped by centuries of water. When I looked up, my chest tightened. At least a dozen people were spread through the creek behind my home, waiting, picnicking, laughing, like this place had always belonged to them. Then I saw what didn't belong. A jagged shard of aluminum, once a beer can, was jammed into the creek bank, slicing straight through a patch of ancient green moss. Downstream, a bright plastic juice pouch spun slowly in a pool that had always stayed clear enough to see the pebbles at the bottom. The water looked wounded. That was when my stomach dropped. Then I saw the sign, a laminated placard staked directly into the mud, reading Zier's Silver Pine Community Creek Accesses. No question mark, no request, just a claim. That creek runs straight through my land. I bought this property in 2012 because of that water. I paid extra for surveys, for clean boundaries, for the kind of peace you don't get back once it's gone. The deed spells it out. Exclusive riparian rights, no easements, no shared access, untouchable. Or at least it was, until the HOA decided confidence mattered more than ownership. And what finally stopped them wasn't an argument. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't even a lawsuit. It was one single report that exposed just how badly they had defiled something they never owned. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to XOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I didn't stumble onto this place by accident. I chose it carefully, the way you choose something you plan to keep for the rest of your life. Cedar Hollow wasn't on any brochure. It wasn't trending. It was just land. Real land. Rolling and wooded, cut through by a creek that had been doing the same quiet work for longer than anyone could remember. When I first walked it, the water moved slow and clear over limestone shelves worn smooth by time. Leaves collected in the bends. Fish held to the deeper pockets. Nothing looked disturbed. That's why I bought it in 2012. Before I signed anything, I paid for a full boundary survey, not the cheap version, the detailed one. Stakes driven deep, lines mapped twice, corners checked and rechecked. I wanted no ambiguity, no assumptions waiting to explode years later. When the paperwork came back, it was clean and unmistakable. Exclusive riparian rights, no easements, no shared access, no historic allowances hiding in the margins. The creek entered my land. The creek crossed my land. The creek left my land simple. For years, that was enough. Mornings meant coffee by the water, watching light crawl across stone. Evenings meant frogs calling from the banks and wind moving through the trees instead of engines and voices. I never touched the creek bed, never reshaped the banks. I treated it like something you don't dominate. You protect it by leaving it alone. Most people didn't even know it existed. Then Silver Pine Estates arrived uphill. First came the machinery, then the foundations. Then rows of identical houses, identical driveways, identical mailboxes lined up with mathematical precision. It was a world built fast, designed to look permanent without earning it. I watched it grow from a distance and didn't think much of it. Different land, different owners, different rules. At first, they barely noticed me. I wasn't part of their association. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't complain about runoff or noise. I kept to myself, and they kept to theirs. Until the summer heat hit hard. The rain stopped early that year. Lawns turned brittle. Retention ponds shrank into muddy bowls. Decorative fountains ran dry. People started looking for relief. And that's when someone noticed the thin blue line on a satellite map just beyond the edge of the subdivision. The first letter arrived late that summer. It was friendly, almost warm. It talked about neighborly cooperation and community wellness. It asked if I would be open to discussing limited access to the creek during peak heat days, phrased like a favor instead of a demand. I read it once and put it away. A few weeks later, another letter came. This one leaned harder. It mentioned shared natural resources, quality of life, and the HOA's responsibility to serve families and children. Still polite, but persistent, I replied calmly. I explained the creek was private property and not subject to HOA authority. I said there was no legal access and no discussion to be had. I assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The letters kept coming. The language shifted. Words like historic access appeared, even though the subdivision hadn't existed long enough to have any history at all. Then it was environmental necessity. Then community responsibility. Each new explanation sounded official enough to make someone second-guess themselves, even when it didn't survive scrutiny. Eventually, the HOA president called me directly. Her name was Linda Ashcroft. Her voice was smooth and confident, practiced in the way people sound when they're used to being obeyed. She talked about children needing outdoor space, about fairness, about how the board believed the creek should serve the community. I told her belief didn't override property law. She chuckled lightly, like I'd missed something obvious, and said, "Let's keep talking." After that, the pressure changed shape. I stopped getting letters and started getting notices. Not fines. They didn't have jurisdiction, but warnings. Suggestions that my fencing could interfere with natural flow. Hints that I could be liable if someone downstream had a problem. Nothing direct. Nothing actionable. Just enough to make a reasonable person uneasy. Neighbors I'd never met began showing up. Some asked questions politely. Others sounded rehearsed. A few tried guilt. One tried intimidation. I gave the same answer every time. The creek is private. The answer is no, calmly. Repeatedly. Then the questions stopped. That's when I noticed footprints along the bank where there had never been any before. Moss crushed flat. A faint path forming through brush I hadn't cleared. The water near the shallow bend stayed cloudy longer than it should have. The HOA wasn't asking anymore. They had decided permission was optional. The first trespass was small enough that I almost talked myself out of reacting to it. Two teenagers, barefoot, hopping stones near the shallow bend where the water barely covered their ankles. They laughed, slipped, splashed, and for a moment I stood there telling myself they didn't know. Kids wander, kids leave. I waited, arms crossed, until they climbed back up the bank and disappeared into the trees. I told myself that was it. It wasn't. A few days later, I pulled into my driveway and heard voices again. This time it wasn't fleeting. A family had set up right along the rocks. Lawn chairs unfolded, a bright plastic cooler wedged between two stones like it had always belonged there. When they noticed me, they waved, the friendly, casual wave people give when they assume they're welcome. I walked down and told them, calmly, that they were on private property. They looked genuinely surprised. The father apologized. The kids scrambled to gather their things. As they packed up, the woman said something that made my chest tighten. "Oh, the HOA said this was fine." That night, the creek sounded different. The water stayed cloudy longer than usual. Sediment kicked up where it had always settled quickly. The moss along the edge was flattened in places, dark and slick where it used to be thick and bright. 2 mornings later, the sign appeared. It was planted right into the creek bank, laminated and clean, like it had been ordered in bulk. Silver Pine Community Creek Access. No logo, no fine print. Just a confident declaration staked into land they didn't own. I pulled it out of the mud, the stake making a wet, sucking sound as it came free, and drove uphill. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I leaned the sign against the front door of the HOA president's house and walked away. Her name was Linda Ashcroft. She called me that afternoon. Her voice was pleasant, measured. The kind people use when they believe they're already in the right. She told me the board had reviewed the situation and approved temporary access for residents during the summer months. She said it like it was a formality, not a violation. I told her there was no such thing as temporary trespass. I told her the creek was private property and that placing signs without permission crossed a legal line. There was a pause. Then she laughed, softly, dismissively, and before I could respond, she said, "You don't own the water." A few days later, she proved she meant it. I was on my porch when her car pulled in. She didn't wait to be invited. She stepped up onto the boards like she belonged there, nudged one of my boots aside with her foot, and leaned on the railing that looked down toward the creek. While she talked, she reached out and casually moved one of the small boundary flags the surveyor had placed weeks earlier, flicking it aside like it was clutter. She talked about families, about kids needing space to play, about how denying access wasn't a good look. Then she tilted her head and said, "I'd hate for people to think you're anti-child." That was the moment any doubt I had left evaporated. After that, everything accelerated. The HOA published a community newsletter with a full-color map. My land was shaded in soft green. The creek was highlighted in bright blue, arrows pointing toward it with cheerful labels about natural gathering spaces. My name wasn't on it. Ownership wasn't mentioned. Flyers followed. Social media posts. Comments filled with invented memories and manufactured traditions. People talked about Or Creek like they'd grown up beside it. Then they announced an event, Creek Day. They promoted it like a festival. Music, food, family activities. I found out when I came home to cars lining my fence line, tires flattening grass that had taken years to grow back. People moved through brush I'd never cut. Someone dragged plastic tables down toward the water. By the time I reached the creek, a rope swing was already hanging from one of my trees. Trash followed fast. Paper plates caught in branches, bottles half buried in gravel. Broken glass glinting near the edge, where kids were standing barefoot. A jagged shard of aluminum sliced through a patch of moss that had taken years to grow, bright and raw against the stone. I told people to leave. Some did, embarrassed. Others argued. A few pulled out their phones and started filming, calling me selfish, calling me greedy, accusing me of denying children access to nature. One man told me I couldn't stop a community resource. I called the non-emergency line. An officer arrived, took statements, and asked everyone to clear out. He was polite, uncomfortable, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Before he left, he told me disputes like this usually worked themselves out. The next morning, the rope swing was back. That's when I called the HOA's attorney. He listened quietly. When I mentioned the signs, the maps, the event, he sighed and asked me not to quote him. Off the record, he said the board knew the situation wasn't solid. He said they were counting on momentum and public pressure. "They're hoping you won't push back," he said. That sentence settled something in me. This creek wasn't a luxury feature. It wasn't scenery. It was the reason I bought the land. Watching strangers trample it, alter it, and claim it as their own flipped a switch I didn't know I had. So I stopped reacting. I started preparing. Because if they thought repetition could turn trespass into ownership, they were about to learn what happens when facts start stacking up instead. Once I stopped reacting, everything slowed down and sharpened. The first call I made was to a surveyor. Not the kind you hire to settle a friendly disagreement, but the kind you bring in when you expect someone to fight the results. He arrived just after sunrise, boots already muddy, a rolled, plat map under his arm. When he drove the first stake into the ground, it landed with a solid thud that echoed faintly through the trees. That sound stayed with me. We walked the creek inch by inch. He checked markers against the deed, verified distances, photographed boundaries from multiple angles. Every measurement matched what I already knew. The creek didn't touch a shared line. It didn't graze an easement. It sat fully inside my land, surrounded on both sides by property I owned outright. Halfway through the walk, he stopped and crouched near the upstream bend. "Did you do this?" he asked. I followed his finger. The bank had been shaved clean in a way erosion doesn't do naturally. Stones had been arranged just enough to redirect the flow, subtle but intentional. It looked neat. Too neat. "I didn't touch it," I said. He nodded once and stood. "You need a water rights consultant." The consultant moved differently, slower, quieter. He listened to the creek the way some people listen to engines. He traced the bed with his boot, knelt to feel the stone placements, and followed runoff channels back toward the subdivision. Where the water bent, he paused. Where it pooled unnaturally, he took photos. "They didn't just make it easier to walk," he said. "They redirected flow." He showed me how runoff from Silver Pine Estates had been guided toward the creek to relieve pressure on their retention system. He pointed out stepping stones placed at precise intervals, banks lowered to create entry points, and widened sections where the current had been slowed on purpose. None of it had permits. None of it had oversight. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. "This creek is a protected tributary under county code." That meant inspections were mandatory when alterations were suspected. It meant fines weren't optional. It meant the issue stopped being about neighbors and started being about compliance. I hired a land use attorney from the county seat the same week. No billboards. No glossy office. Just a man who'd spent decades watching confident people underestimate process. I laid the evidence out on his desk. Survey photos, timestamps, maps the HOA had published themselves. He read quietly, then leaned back. "They didn't just cross a line," he said. "They erased it." He explained it plainly. Unauthorized alterations triggered inspections. Inspections triggered citations. Citations triggered penalties. And because the HOA had encouraged public access under false authority, they had exposed themselves to liability far beyond anything a private dispute would have reached. I asked him what to do next. He didn't hesitate. "You don't warn them. You don't confront them. You document. Then you report." Timing mattered, he said. If I rushed, they'd clean up and claim ignorance. If I waited, their confidence would do the work for me. So I waited. I let creek days stretch into more weekends. I let the paths deepen and the stones settle. I recorded board members pointing, explaining, directing. I saved emails that framed the creek as a community amenity. Every day they acted like it was theirs. The record grew heavier. What struck me most was how comfortable they were. No hiding. No caution. Just repetition, like saying something often enough would make it true. But repetition doesn't change the law, and water law doesn't bend. When the attorney finally said I had enough, he slid a short list across the desk. I didn't need all of it. I didn't need spectacle. I needed one report, one submission that would turn this from an argument into a matter of record. The moment I decided to make it, The creek stopped being something I had to defend with words. It became something the county would defend with authority. By the time I was ready to move, the anger had burned itself out. Anger rushes you. It makes you sloppy. What replaced it was something colder and far more useful: focus. The kind that narrows your vision and quiets everything else. The kind that doesn't argue, because it already knows how this ends. I didn't confront the HOA again. I didn't email Linda. I didn't show up at a meeting. I didn't give them a single word they could twist or prepare against. Every interaction would have warned them. Every warning would have given them time. So I documented. Every morning before the sun cleared the ridge, I walked the creek with my phone locked into airplane mode and a small notebook in my pocket. I logged the weather first. Temperature, cloud cover, whether it had rained overnight, then the time, written out carefully. Precision mattered. Patterns mattered. I photographed everything. Wide shots to show context. Close shots to show intent. Stones that had been placed, not fallen. Banks shaved clean in straight lines instead of worn naturally. Footpaths cut so deeply they exposed roots that had never seen daylight before. Trash that hadn't drifted in, but had been dropped, crushed, and ground into the gravel. When people talked, I let them. I recorded board members explaining where residents should park. I captured casual comments about or access point and the easiest crossing. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react. I just let the words stack up. Then I flew the drone. The first time it lifted, the low hum of the blades cut through the valley, steady and unmistakable. From above, the creek told a different story. On the screen, GPS coordinates pulsed softly at the corner. Height, contrast filters made the alterations stand out. Runoff channels bending unnaturally toward the water. Widened banks glowing against untouched ground. I flew the same path every time, same altitude, same angle, same duration. The footage lined up perfectly. One flight over the next, making the changes impossible to deny. This wasn't recording anymore. It was assembling a case. At night, my kitchen table turned into a workstation. The click, clack of the keyboard filled the house as files were labeled, dates matched, footage referenced. Survey stakes went back in during the day, each one driven with a solid, satisfying thud that marked another boundary no one could argue with later. Then the HOA announced another event, bigger, louder, more confident: live music, food trucks, family activities. They called it a celebration of community space. I knew exactly what that meant. So I waited. That weekend, I stayed out of sight and recorded quietly. Cars lined the road again. Kids ran ahead of their parents. Someone carried rope. Someone else hauled stakes and a mallet. Board members smiled and waved people down toward the water. Every step into the creek. Every stone moved. Every child encouraged to climb the bank. By sunset, the water stayed cloudy long after the crowd left. The banks looked raw. The moss was gone in places it had taken years to grow. That night, I didn't rush. I organized. I opened the county environmental compliance portal and read the form twice before typing anything. It didn't ask how I felt. It didn't care who I was. It wanted facts, location, description, evidence, nature of impact. So that's what I gave it. Unauthorized alteration of a protected tributary. Unpermitted redirection of runoff. Encouraged public access resulting in environmental degradation. I attached the survey, the photographs, the videos, the drone footage with property lines overlaid and timestamps intact. No accusations. No commentary. No emotion. Just facts. When I hit submit, there was no rush of victory, just a quiet certainty that something irreversible had started. The confirmation email came less than an hour later. A case number. Review pending. 2 days after that, another message arrived. An inspection had been scheduled within 72 hours. And the most unsettling part was knowing the HOA had no idea. They were still planning. Still advertising. Still, acting like repetition had already turned trespass into ownership. They didn't know inspectors were pulling records. They didn't know permits were being checked. They didn't know the footage was already flagged. And I didn't tell them, because once that report was filed, this stopped being about me protecting my land. It became about the county protecting the creek. And when that happens, there is no backing out. The inspectors arrived while the music was still playing. I felt it before I saw it. The soundscape changed. Laughter faltered. A speaker crackled as someone turned the volume down. Conversations thinned into uneasy murmurs. Then the first county truck rolled in, moving slow and deliberate, tires crunching gravel like it had all the time in the world. A second followed, then a third. Doors opened. 3 inspectors stepped out with badges clipped to their belts, clipboards tucked under their arms, measuring equipment slung over their shoulders. They didn't look around for guidance. They didn't ask questions. They walked straight toward the creek like they'd already been here in their heads. One of them raised his voice just enough to carry. Everyone needs to clear the water immediately. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry. It was final. Parents called their kids back. Chairs scraped across stone. Coolers snapped shut. People looked around confused and irritated, trying to figure out who had ruined their afternoon. A few glanced uphill toward the HOA table, waiting for reassurance. That's when Linda Ashcroft hurried down the slope. She still had that practiced smile on, the one meant to project control. She started talking before she even reached them, gesturing broadly toward the creek, explaining how the community used it, how important it was for families, how long it had been happening. She talked fast, like if she filled the air long enough, the facts wouldn't have room to land. The lead inspector listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked a single question. "Do you have permits for the alterations to this waterway?" The smile collapsed. What followed was quiet and surgical. Measuring tapes stretched across the creek bed. Small flags went into the ground, marking stone placements and bank cuts. Cameras clicked. Notes were written carefully, line by line. One inspector waded into the water and crouched, tracing the flow with his hand, following the way it bent where it never used to. Linda tried again. She pointed toward my property line. She gestured sharply, like blame could be redirected with enough force. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the posture. It didn't matter. Citation forms came out. Pages flipped. Pens moved steadily. When the inspector handed Linda the paperwork, she scanned the first page, then the second, then looked up like she wanted to argue, and thought better of it. The color drained from her face. After about 40 minutes, the inspectors turned back to the crowd. Effective immediately, the creek was closed to public access pending further review. Any signage indicating community use was to be removed. Any further entry would be considered a violation subject to enforcement. Just like that, Creek Day was over. People packed up in silence. Some were angry. Some looked embarrassed. A few stared at the HOA board like they were seeing them for the first time. The music never came back on. Cars pulled away slower than they'd arrived. That afternoon, the HOA tried to get ahead of it. Posts went up accusing me of being hostile, selfish, anti-community. They claimed I had sabotaged a family event out of spite. They framed it as a personal dispute, suggesting I had pulled strings or called in favors. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because the next morning, the county released the preliminary report. It was public record, written without emotion or commentary, unauthorized alterations to a protected tributary, unpermitted redirection of runoff, environmental impact caused by repeated foot traffic and artificial structures, encouragement of public access without legal authority. Dates were listed, locations specified, evidence collected during the inspection referenced directly. It made one thing unmistakably clear. This wasn't about a neighbor being difficult. This was about an HOA breaking the law. The reaction shifted almost instantly. Comments that had attacked me the day before turned toward the board. People started asking real questions. Why weren't permits obtained? Who approved the changes? Why were residents told the creek was communal when it wasn't? Linda released a statement later that day. It was vague and defensive, full of phrases like miscommunication and temporary oversight. It didn't mention citations. It didn't explain the flags still marking the creek bed. It didn't answer anything that mattered. The county didn't argue. It didn't negotiate. It didn't posture. It documented. It published. It moved forward. And for the first time since this began, the balance of power shifted completely. The HOA was no longer dealing with me. They were dealing with the county. And that silence was louder than anything they'd thrown at me before. The final findings came down a week later, and they landed like a verdict that had already been decided. The county's report wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It read like a ledger, precise, unemotional, and absolute. Page after page laid out what had happened, when it happened, and why none of it could be explained away. Unauthorized alteration of private land, environmental damage to a protected tributary, false representation of access rights to residents, encouragement of repeated trespass that resulted in measurable harm. Each violation stood on its own. Together, they were devastating. The report included side-by-side photographs taken from the same angles weeks apart. One set showed the creek as it had been, narrow banks, intact moss, water moving clean and uninterrupted. The other showed what the HOA had done: widened entry points, stones arranged with intention, channels cut to bend the flow. Inspectors had annotated everything in careful handwriting, arrows pointing to alterations, notes explaining exactly how and why the water behaved differently now. Then came the penalties. The total fines exceeded $200,000, broken down into individual violations tied to specific actions and specific dates. Some penalties were assessed per day. Others were tied directly to mandatory restoration work. Every amount was justified. Every amount was enforceable. That was when the insurance company made its move. Or rather, refused to. The denial letter arrived less than a day after the report became public. The language was blunt. The HOA had acted knowingly. They had advertised access they did not have the right to grant. They had altered a protected waterway without permits. They had continued even after informal warnings. Coverage was denied. No defense fund, no legal cushion, no safety net. The HOA was responsible for every dollar. Panic followed quickly. An emergency board meeting was called, and this time the room was packed. People brought printed copies of the report. Passages were read aloud. Questions weren't polite anymore. Who approved the signs? Who authorized the events? Who decided permits weren't necessary? How much would each homeowner be assessed to cover the fines? Linda Ashcroft tried to speak. She didn't get far. Voices cut her off. Someone quoted her own newsletter language back at her. Someone else demanded to know why residents were told the creek was communal when it never was. The confidence she'd worn so easily before evaporated under the weight of facts she couldn't deflect. Within a week, her resignation was announced. The statement was brief and carefully worded, full of phrases like personal reasons and best interests of the community. It didn't mention the fines. It didn't mention the report. It didn't acknowledge responsibility. It didn't matter. Her departure didn't stabilize the board. It exposed how fragile it already was. One by one, other members stepped down. Meetings were canceled. Committees dissolved. The HOA's attorney formally withdrew, citing conflicts and non-payment. With no leadership, no funds, and no credibility, the association unraveled. The county placed it under administrative review. freezing discretionary authority and suspending enforcement powers until new elections could be held under direct oversight. For the first time since Silver Pine Estates existed, the HOA couldn't issue notices, pass motions, or claim authority over anything beyond basic maintenance. As for the creek, the county treated it as its own case. Restoration was mandatory. Crews arrived under an approved environmental plan. Stepping stones were removed by hand, ropes came down, artificial channels were filled and stabilized. Native plants were replanted along the banks to prevent erosion. Temporary barriers went up so the land could heal without interference. Every bit of it was paid for by the HOA. I watched the work from my porch over the following weeks. No shortcuts, no improvisation. Inspectors returned repeatedly, checking progress against the plan, signing off only when each stage met the standard. When they finished, the creek looked the way it had when I first bought the land. Clear water, natural banks. No scars carved by crowds, no signs claiming ownership, just water moving where it always had. The county recorded a permanent notice reaffirming my exclusive riparian rights and attached it to both my deed and the HOA's public record. There would be no confusion in the future, no room for reinterpretation, no chance for confidence to masquerade as authority again. The final letter I received from the county thanked me for reporting the issue, not for winning, not for standing my ground, for reporting. By the time it was over, the HOA that tried to take my creek didn't exist in any meaningful way anymore. And the creek flowed on, indifferent to their ambition, exactly where it belonged. By the time the last signature dried, the fight had already bled out of the valley. The county recorded a permanent notice reaffirming my exclusive rights to the land and the creek, and this time it wasn't buried in technical language or tucked into a database no one checks. It was plain, direct, attached to my deed and cross, reference to the former HOA's records. Anyone who pulled a title search in the future would see it immediately. There would be no room left for reinterpretation, no future board able to claim confusion, no quiet rewriting of facts. The access point vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. Crews removed the gravel path and hauled it away by the truckload. The widened entry was torn out, the soil graded back to its natural slope, stakes and rope came down. The disturbed ground was replanted with native grasses chosen specifically to discourage foot traffic and hold the banks together. Where people had once lined up to wade in, there was nothing but brush and the soft smell of fresh soil. I rebuilt the fence after that. Not taller, not aggressive, just unmistakable. The posts went in deep, each one set square and straight. Along the line, I mounted simple signs at regular intervals. No warnings, no threats, no legal jargon, just clear statements of private property and no public access. They weren't there to scare anyone. They were there to remove any excuse. I added cameras too. They weren't hidden. They didn't need to be. Anyone walking the boundary could see them mounted in plain sight, angled toward the places people had once slipped through. Quiet, constant, impartial. The kind of presence that doesn't confront and doesn't forget. Then the noise stopped. Not all at once, but completely. No more laughter drifting down the valley. No engines idling along the fence. No voices carrying where only wind used to travel. The creek began to clear faster after rain. Sediment settled again. The frogs returned to the same spots they'd abandoned during the worst of it. The land started healing on its own. The apologies came slower. They didn't arrive as announcements or public statements. They came one at a time, when people felt brave enough to admit they'd been wrong. One afternoon, while I was resetting a camera near the old access point, a man pulled his truck over and got out. I recognized him immediately. He'd been one of the loudest voices during Creek Day, the one who'd filmed me and called me selfish. He didn't raise his voice this time. I brought something back," he said, reaching into the bed of his truck. He handed me a small wooden marker, one of my boundary posts that had been pulled up and tossed aside during the event. The bottom was still caked with dried mud. "We shouldn't have touched your stuff," he said. "They told us you were just being difficult, that you hated kids, that you didn't care about anyone but yourself." He looked toward the creek, quiet again. "I see now it was never theirs to give." He waited, like he expected me to say something sharp. I didn't. I thanked him and put the marker back where it belonged. After that, others followed. A woman left a note in my mailbox apologizing for believing what she'd been told. A couple stopped me on the road to say they'd trusted the board because it was easier than asking questions. None of them asked for forgiveness. They just acknowledged the truth. That mattered more. The former board members disappeared from view. Some sold their homes. Others kept to themselves. No one tried to test the line. No one asked for exceptions or compromises. No one mentioned the creek at all. The boundary held. What stayed with me wasn't the fines or the collapse of the HOA. It was how quickly everything settled once authority was applied correctly. No shouting. No revenge. No ongoing tension. Just process doing what it was meant to do. The creek didn't need me to fight forever. It just needed me to protect it once properly. One morning, not long after the restoration was complete, I stood at the bend where the water dips deeper and watched a trout slip back into a pocket beneath the limestone shelf. It had been gone for months. Now it held there again, steady against the current, exactly where it used to. That's when I knew it was over. Not because the law said so, because the land did. I still walk the creek every morning, just like I did before any of this began. The light hits the limestone the same way it always has, slow and golden, and the water moves with that patient, unhurried sound that tells you nothing is being forced anymore. The kingfisher has returned to its branch. The frogs have reclaimed the shallows. If you didn't know what happened here, you'd think nothing ever had. The land didn't change. People did. What really shifted wasn't ownership or paperwork. It was the assumption that confidence could replace consent. That if someone speaks loudly enough or long enough, they can turn what isn't theirs into something everyone just accepts. That's how HOAs cross the line when they forget their limits. They rely on pressure, on fatigue, on the idea that pushing back takes more energy than giving in. But sometimes pushing back doesn't mean shouting. Sometimes it means slowing down, paying attention, learning the rules better than the people abusing them. One paper trail, one report, one moment where authority finally meets accountability. I didn't win because I embarrassed anyone or tried to get even. I didn't win because I was louder or meaner. I won because I stayed patient, stayed factual, and let the system do exactly what it was designed to do. If you're dealing with something like this, remember that boundaries matter, especially when someone pretends they don't. Silence helps bullies. Facts stop them. And in the end, the quiet always comes back. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Gone Wild Dar, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?